Welcome to this anthropology lecture. This is lecture 14. We're going to be taking a look at trade. In the last lecture, we introduced the sort of overall mechanics of economic anthropology and talked about some economic terms. We talked about some forms of exchange, reciprocity, and three different kinds of reciprocity. We're going to extend a look at the issue of reciprocal relationships, trade, um, and take a look at the case of ancient Egypt and sort of inquire whether or not Egypt could be classified under world systems theory, which some Egyptologists have attempted to do. So we'll find out if this theory actually works or not. First, we have to talk about world systems theory and what that exactly entails. Emanuel Wallerstein, who died actually recently, proposed this theory about exchange in the world being based on maximizing profit and increasing capital. In other words, making money. And so we should think about, in terms of anthropological economics, whether or not exchange is about making money for all peoples, or is this merely a feature of more modern economies? In other words, were the ancient peoples of the world capitalists as we understand the term? Or did they see exchange in a different way in their culture? Was it about maximizing profit and increasing capital? Well, let's find out. Wallerstein also talked about ways of classifying different nations within this world system. He said that there were core nations which find places around the world where they can exploit labor and raw materials. Those nations that get exploited are on the periphery. They're usually underdeveloped and weaker. They have lots of resources, but maybe no organization or political control that would enable the use of those resources in any extensive way. So the core jumps in and exploits those peripheral nations for what they have, their labor, their raw materials and resources. And in between are semi-periphery nations who have features of the core, but are not quite as developed as the core. This is the model that Wallerstein proposed here, the core producing all kinds of goods based on extracting raw materials and cheap labor from the periphery, with the poor semi-periphery people in the middle. The goal of this entire system is to make money. So this is capitalism in the sort of way we know it. Here's a more intensive diagram of the same thing, where you see money flowing from core to periphery nations in order to extract labor and natural resources, not for investment because, we love those periphery nations. No, it's all about getting what we can out of them, using them. Poor nations tend to be industrialized, high incomes. They tend to have lots of political and economic control over markets, and they benefit getting poor places to do their work for them, and getting cheap raw materials from them. And in return, they can sell the things they manufacture to those peripheral nations. So does this work for Egypt? Well, some exploratory thoughts about Egypt have suggested that it could possibly work in the Egyptian case, but in what way would it work? Well, once Egypt is unified, it does have a capital. That capital, of course, will move because capitals don't always stay in the same place. Centers of power don't always stay in the same place. So there could be a case for a core, the core of the Egyptian state, and then reaching out its tendrils or tentacles, however you imagine them, to poorer, less organized places to extract resources. We do know the Egyptians have extensive trade. We've already hinted at the fact that they're not isolated. The Nile is not just some lovely place that they're all having a great time in and that's all they ever see. They are getting involved in other areas of the world, Um, in the Naqada period, we see them reaching to the Levant, which is places like where Israel, Palestine, Syria would be located today. Copper, turquoise, wood, especially wood, because there's not so much wood in Egypt, or at least usable wood that the Egyptians want to build boats out of. Grapes, olives, wood twice. Why wood twice? Because once again, the Egyptians really, really prize hardwoods, especially cedar from the Levant. To the south of Egypt, the Egyptians are getting resources out of Nubia, gold, ebony, ivory from elephants, leopard skins, incense from resins grown on trees. And from even further south, a place called Punt, they are extracting things like myrrh, which is an aromatic incense perfume kind of product, ebony, ivory, gold, spices, skins, and exotic animals. We don't know how this trade took place, but we presume that it was through barter. So this is a reciprocal exchange in which a group is trying to get X by trading Y. So it's not a money-based exchange. We don't exactly know how they communicated in this this reciprocity that they have going on through barter. Scholars think it's probably silent trade. The Egyptians come in and they lay an object on the ground and they point to it, and the people come up and say, lay down their objects, and they move around objects until people are like, we got it, we're good. So we're not exactly sure how this reciprocity took place. We're not entirely sure if it was the kind of reciprocity where the Egyptians are trying to get a trading advantage, or they are really truly regarding each other on fairly equal terms, equalized reciprocity. But what we do know, and this is an interesting sort of cultural perception of the trade, Egyptian sources refer to this trade as tribute from foreign nations. So anytime these things come back into Egypt, the gold, the ebony, the ivory, the leopard skins, they're always written up in official monuments as tribute from these foreign countries. These foreign countries are bowing before the might of Egypt and presenting wonderful things. And in return, the king of Egypt sends gifts. So that suggests culturally that what we have going on here is not a kind of capitalism, at least capitalism in the way we understand it, where the sole object is to make money, to get the best trade deal possible in exchange for the purpose of getting ahead of the other guy. At least culturally, the Egyptians aren't describing it that way. They are putting this trade, however it occurs, in the context of a tribute to the Egyptian state. Oh, worthy, wonderful Egyptian state, here's our tribute of gold to you. And in exchange, the king of Egypt reciprocates with a gift. So far, does it sound like world systems theory is holding for Egypt? Well, let's think. Here's a depiction of some trade going on. This is the groups of people from the south of Egypt bringing various trade goods. Notice the colors of their skin. The artist has attempted to suggest that these are not the same kinds of people as Egyptians. Notice we got a little leopard skin here. It looks like a little kitty cat, actually, a little kitty cat doll. It's kind of sad. It's just a map showing trade with the world for Egypt in this time period. And not that Egypt is trading directly with these places over in Afghanistan, but this trade is occurring and products are reaching over into the Levant, which would be this area here. So this would be the Levant here. So trade is reaching that area with containing things that the Egyptians could not get directly from very far away places. And we do know the Egyptians are traveling to the south as well. So the land of Punt probably down here in what would today be Ethiopia. Here's another map showing the same thing, a little bit more direct for focus on Egypt, with the map also telling you what they are getting. So gold, copper, timber. The Egyptians are trading as far away as, Greece and Crete, um, all up in the Levant here, this section right here. So Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. What were the Egyptians trading? What did they have to offer? Um, so the Egyptians have gold, and that, of course, will open many doors in many different places. But the Egyptians also produce high quality linen, so linen clothing could have been an object of trade. Um, the Egyptians produced papyrus for writing on. That might have been traded, though it's harder to see that survive archaeologically because it disintegrates so easily. In Egypt, it's fine because Egypt is dry, but other places, not so much. We find Egyptian ceramics and jewelry in various places around the ancient Mediterranean. So those are probably the objects the Egyptians rely on most to open trade doors for them. Now, if we look closer to home, say just south of Egypt, we could possibly make a case that Egypt is acting as a core region to its southern neighbor of Nubia and the areas just south of Nubia. We see expeditions to Nubia in the Old Kingdom in the First Dynasty. By the fourth, Sneferu is organizing large-scale campaigns against Nubia in which they capture 7,000 people and 200,000 head of cattle. The Egyptians are building forts to have military control over that area. A good example is Buin, which we see in existence in the Second Dynasty, but really takes off in the Fourth and in the Middle Kingdom, where Buin is a center of control over mining, trade mining of stones and copper. And these forts, like Buin, allowed Egypt to not just merely rely on trade, but have military backing for access to the resources of Nubia. So you can go beat up your neighbors and make sure that you get gold, ivory, ebony, animals, and slaves. We might make a case for Byblos, though this is probably a little bit harder. Byblos is an area on the coast, Mediterranean coast, sort of. I'll show you where a map is. But if you imagine Israel today, that area. In some places, you will see reference to Egypt's control over Byblos as almost like quasi-overlords. Other Egyptologists dispute that, and they argue that Byblos was pretty much independent, but certainly was in Egypt's cultural orbit. There were a number of Egyptians there, and those Egyptians copied hieroglyphs, they copied Egyptian jewelry, and that might represent some cultural imperialism. That is, Egypt is the core, and its culture is sweeping outwards into the Mediterranean. So you've got Possibly an example of world systems here, Egypt as core, with military control over Nubia, and maybe a little bit of cultural control in the example of Byblos. This is a reconstruction of the fort at Buin. You can see it's enormous, it's massive. And of course, it's meant to convey the power of the Egyptian state when you look at the size of it. When enemies would attempt to attack, they would certainly think twice about it. The fort was excavated, but it is now currently underwater. So here's a picture before it was flooded with the building of the Aswan Dam. You can see just how imposing these mud brick walls of this fort would have been. This is an impressive edifice to scare one's enemies and to maintain control over the important trade of Nubia. Here's a map just so you can see where Byblos is located. So it's up here, so close to Syria. Imagine Israel is right here, and then Egypt down here. The archaeological sites, Byblos, are fascinating and ongoing and quite interesting in of themselves. This is the one of the sites here pictured that you can see. It's overlooking the coast. You see the trees, which those don't look impressive, but one of the things the Egyptians absolutely were must-have items for were the cedars of Lebanon, the tall trees to build ships and to build furniture and to build shrines for tombs. We do know that artifacts from Byblos and other Mediterranean sites made their way to Egypt. There are two images of what's called the Todd treasure from a place at south of Luxor called El Todd. These were found in 1936. There was a chest made for King Amenemhat II, and you see lots of artifacts here made of silver, likely from Byblos, because these are not Egyptian designs. But clearly, Egypt is benefiting from its relationship with these places like Tyre and Sidon and Byblos on the Mediterranean coast. So one of the things the Egyptians definitely had plenty of, and it certainly attracted their neighbors, probably made them a powerhouse in terms of, economic control, would have been gold. Not that the Egyptians are the only people who have access to gold. There are lots of different places for people to get gold, but the Egyptians have an impression of having a lot of it, though perhaps at some point they mined out all that they could, and tomb robbing and recycling of previous gold sort of kept up the supply in later Egyptian history. Gold was revered as the flesh of the gods, so this is a sacred object with religious significance to it. We see very early on in Egyptian history that the gold that's available is associated with the king. So the counting of gold is mentioned in the Palermo stone as an activity associated with the king's house. This is the word for gold, Nebu. May be the origin of the word Nubia. It's quite possible that Egypt's control over gold may have been one of its leveraging tools for gaining access to foreign trade and foreign rulers, maybe the gift that foreign rulers expected as part of trade agreements to provide Egypt with whatever Egypt wanted. We do certainly get that impression from a stone tablet. This is one of the so-called Amarna letters. This is Amarna letter 19. So this is from the New Kingdom of Egypt, in which king of Mitanni, a Levant kingdom to the north. This king was Tushratta, wrote to the king of Egypt about 1386 BCE for gold. And he wrote the letter in such a way as to sort of shame the Egyptians. You promised me gold, and I look at how much gold was given to my relatives before me. And then he, toward the end of the letter, he says, I also asked my brother, the king of Egypt, for much gold, because in my brother's country, gold is as plentiful as dirt. Now, of course, flattery being what it is, yes, you're definitely going to flatter, cajole, and wheedle your way into getting gifts. But it could be possible that this gift giving represents a more of a formal trade relationship, almost like a treaty per se. It's just not being phrased in the words of a treaty like we would call it today, a trade treaty. Calling the king of Egypt your brother implies a relationship as well. And so, one of the important things psychologically about reciprocity is that it creates bonds between people. It connects people. And if you can leverage those bonds, you can get what you want out of relationships. We see this in Native American societies as well. If you've had me for APUSH, I've talked about reciprocity among Native peoples, gift giving as a sign of connection and bonding and the expectation for gifts. And Native peoples called the colonials brothers. They called the King of England fathers. So you can see how this familial language might increase these bonds and bring about the desired object of getting gold. We have lots of different stories of Egyptian expeditions and travels to get the things that Egypt wanted. Some of these are quite interesting, so I'm going to tell you about two of them really quickly. These are just interesting examples. I don't expect you to memorize these for any exams or tests. This is probably my favorite Harkuf, 2255 BCE. He served under King Merenre the First and Pepi Merenre, not easy for me to say, and Pepi the Second. He did 4 expeditions to Nubia and to a place called Yam, which was probably just to the south of Nubia, where he brought back incense once again. They like to smell good. Ebony, like the wood, beautiful wood. Grain, panthers, ivory, and then in his autobiography he says, every good product. Good for you, Harkuf, you left the bad products down in Nubia. But my favorite part of the Harkuf expedition is where Pepi II, who was then a child, a very young child, sent a letter to Harkuf. And this letter was so important. Harkuf had it inscribed for his tomb at Aswan. And the letter says in very specific detail that there is one thing that Pepi II wants Harkuf to bring back. He didn't care. Ivory, great. And ebony, we got that. Panthers, that's fine. What he really wants is a dancing dwarf. The dancing dwarf of the god from the land of the spirits. And Pepi gives Harkuf very specific directions to take care of this dancing dwarf. When he goes down with thee in the vessel, appoint excellent people who shall be beside him on each side of the vessel. Be careful, you got to watch him. Take care lest he fall in the water. We don't want our little person falling over the side. When he sleeps at night, appoint excellent people who shall sleep beside him, and in his tent inspect 10 times a night. 10 times? This poor little person's not going to get any sleep. My majesty desires to see this dwarf more than the gifts of Sinai and of Punt. Now, little kids' excitement aside, this would also suggest, too, that trade for the ancient Egyptians was not necessarily based in capitalism, not necessarily based in money making. And so maybe world systems theory doesn't work out quite so well if we look at the story of Harkuf. You know, this is a get an expedition for bringing back things that will please the king. And yes, they're objects of value, but the value is more than just a monetary value. It's a spiritual value. It's just a model of a funerary boat from a tomb early in the reign of Amenemhat I, the 12th dynasty. The Egyptians, quite good at boat building and sailing to go through the Mediterranean up and down the Nile. So that, of course, helped facilitate their trade immensely. But also in religious connotations, we've talked about boats being buried beside pyramids. Re travels in a boat through the sky and then through the underworld to regenerate. Weni is our next example of an autobiography. It's a 6th dynasty court official who worked just before Harkuf under 3 different kings, Teti, Pepi, and Merenre. He did military invasions into the Levant and the Sinai, so going to the north of Egypt. These military incursions are not described in terms of trade, but the Egyptians certainly did have trade interests in those regions. And specifically, he mentions battling the sand dwellers, and I think sand people, every time I read this, 5 times. Probably a group of people living in southern Palestine, and he describes laying waste to their houses and their fields. He carried out census record keeping twice for the king. You got to know what's in your country in order to know what your resources are and to know who's got what. So census taking is pretty important. And he was sent in multiple expeditions to find materials for the king's burial. So a sarcophagus, a pyramidion, a false door, libation stones, an alabaster altar. These expeditions to the south, bringing back these objects. Once again, is this trade? Is this just confiscation? Is this the core, just claiming the resources of the periphery? And if it is it all about capitalism, or is there a deeper meaning behind it? Something that has to do more with religious and spiritual significance. We're going to end with the non-Egyptian story because Wallerstein's sort of theory of a world system really gets applied with the Columbian exchange that you've talked about in world studies. We've talked about it in APUSH and US history. The 15th century explorations of the Europeans that linked old worlds and new worlds launched a massive exchange of people, resources, ideas, and diseases. We call that the Columbian exchange. But it also launched a massive development of colonial plantation economies based on the production of sugar and tobacco, and eventually cotton. Cotton really takes off in the 19th century, not so much earlier than that. And these monoculture plantation crops need to be cared for through a vast extraction of labor, at first from native peoples of the New World, but then they get sick and die. And then through an indentured servitude of poor, desperate, hungry white Europeans, and then finally through a transatlantic slave trade, which makes the New World the epicenter of enslavement of people from Africa and the construction of a race-based justification for their enslavement. So Wallerstein's system may not work quite as well for Egypt. Maybe some of the elements are there, but we see it probably work most with the 15th century Columbian exchange moving forward. Maybe Egypt did have some elements of control and domination as the core over the periphery, but the goal overall was not extraction of resources for making money. After all, everything was to please Pharaoh. The heart of the king would be delighted with all the beautiful products brought as tribute from these foreign lands. And that's it for this lecture.